So we have time for some questions from the audience. There's a mic here up front if you want to come up here so everyone can hear you. My first reaction to the data, so this last week I was asked by another labor union to help facilitate a conversation amongst their members and leadership about on issues of racial equity. And one of the questions I asked the group to discuss was that I knew from the information they gave me that this particular union, 65% of their members would be of retirement age in the next 5 years. And it is a union that is right now overwhelmingly white and becoming more diverse. And it's very clear that that as the retirement wave hits, that it will be much more diverse. And I asked the question, what does the union have to do differently to be a welcoming place for everyone? And I didn't think, and I had to take a step back because in the conversation, it was someone challenged just this premise that we had to do anything differently. Why do we assume that we have to do anything differently? So I guess that's my first question to you all, really, as you think about your questions and come up to the mic, and to our presenters. I know Compass is not, you're not policymakers, you put together data, but KaYing, you definitely have ideas. Like, when we say do something different, do things differently for our current population and the population of the future, what are the kinds of things that we are talking about beyond what I think, some unexpected things perhaps that people are not necessarily thinking about?
I think that, I don't know what you will do differently, but I know what Cal did differently. This time, instead of just starting a nonprofit and start working on issues, we also did what other people didn't expect out of us. We did collection of data and analyzing data. And we had our own set of data to say, here's why you should be doing this, right? So I think that as communities of color, we also need to change the way that we normally do business and really to challenge the system using the tools that the system understands, right? So like I said, every time I go into a conference or a meeting where I see the aggregate data, I now have tools to say, but when you break it down, this is what it looks like. I did not have the language for that. I didn't have the analysis for that. That's why you didn't see my presentation with a lot of data, because I'm still learning about how to use data to benefit my community. And this is why I urge Ruth to say, show me how to use your data to help me, right? So even if though, yes, you can clap. So even though they can't be doing advocacy work, she can also help empower me to do the advocacy work, And so this is the ongoing conversation that we have. I think the qualitative data is also very important because people talking about their personal lives and challenges is more powerful than the numbers, right? And you can see, I purposely read the quotations because I wanted to give credit to those people that responded to us, Even second generation Hmong people in this country who speak English fluently don't know how to navigate the educational system. And I know even white parents don't know how to navigate the system, but how come we're not working together to say, this is how and this is what we should be asking when we go to teacher-parent conference, right? So I think that we are all facing the same challenges, but because we are working in silos and say, oh, you're Hmong, so you have your own Hmong PTO or whatever. I think that we have to start doing that, and we need to collaborate more, right? So I think that's it. The other thing is that Cal is trying to do more legislative policy changes as well. I think our community has gone through an evolution politically with the election of more Asians, more Asians, 3 people to the Capitol. I mean, it's empowered us to say, we can also go to the Capitol and make some changes, right? So as Americans, we are embracing that democracy, but we need to also understand what that democratic process is like and not be so overwhelmed and intimidated by that process. So when I go to the Capitol, if I'm nervous, I hold on to another person who's a community advocate, and we go together so that we're not so nervous, And I hope that when you see me at the Capitol, you come and hold my hand, and we can go and meet legislators too. So I think that this is the kind of stuff that I think we should do differently.
And Ruth, if as a data person, if you could instruct the state of Minnesota on like what I need when it comes to youth, the information what other information you wish would be collected for you to be able to present, is there anything that jumps out at you in particular? Because the thing that jumped out at me about KaYing's presentation was just, using language to overlay on top of the aggregated data to try to figure out what the reality is. But that feels so imprecise when the information seems there to be gotten.
Sure, that's a big question. Kind of, what would the dream scenario be? I think. Ultimately, that would have to be determined in a conversation with the students and the families and the people that need the data. But as far as possible, getting crosstabs is helpful. So looking at cross-tabulations of race by income, by geography, and breaking down into more disaggregated data where possible, considering that in looking a little bit more broadly than just education data, there are communities that tend to be more marginalized, including in the data collection. And so it's kind of an issue of equity and an issue of data, just having good data to make sure that we can invest in data sources that are useful for everybody.
You had a question?
Could you please talk about the legislative challenges that you've encountered, barriers, whatever, in terms of getting the state to look at disaggregated data? Definitely in the Asian community, but also in the Black community, it's huge. And then also, do you have an opinion about the opt-out movement and its impact on our ability to gather data on student achievement? Thanks a lot.
So what we did this last legislative session is that we worked very closely with MnCAN on a bill called the All Kids Count Act, sponsored by Senator Kent. And, Cal has been promoting data disaggregation for a long time. And in fact, I want to credit the Asian American community nationwide for pushing data disaggregation, because that's happening in California, it's happening in DC. The White House Initiative on Asian American Pacific Islanders have been encouraging the U.S. Department of Education to disaggregate data. So it just happens in Minnesota, Cal has been spearheading this, and MnCAN drafted a bill which we all worked on. And I have to say that it was the Republican Party that was actually very supportive of the data disaggregation. And so we were able to get bipartisan support, and that's why the bill was passed. There was a lot of, I know I'm being videotaped, but there was a lot of pushback by the Minnesota Department of Education. Not that they didn't want to collect data, but they said it was too expensive, right? That's what I always hear. Too expensive, they didn't have the systems to collect the data. And so we were trying to make the case that you need to collect this data because that we wanted that cross-tabulation, right? So at the end, we had a day at the Capitol, and it was our first at the Capitol, and we brought over 100 people, and Song and other people in the room were there. And we used that as our talking point and used that as the message to educate our legislators. And soon thereafter, the bill was passed. So Minnesota, now you are the first in the state, one of the first in the state of the United States to have policies that say that MDE must disaggregate data. They still don't have the funding to do it, so we have asked them to apply for a grant with the U.S. Department to get money so that they can develop the tools. Now, the other pushback was that you all know that every Student Succeeds Act is coming down the pipeline, and MDE is now charged with developing a state plan around accountabilities. And so the ESA also requires data disaggregation, so they're waiting to see what those requirements are so that they can do it. But like I said, we wanted to ensure that the bill was passed so that it's in law. Whether they do it or not, it's in law, right? Because if you don't get the bill passed, then it's not in law and you can't push anymore, right? So that was one of the experience that we had. So I think you all should celebrate that that bill did pass and you need to follow it, right? So yeah, thank you. For the opt-out, I don't know enough about opt-out, but I also feel like I think traditionally opt-out was mostly parents who have more privileges, right, who would opt out. And I think now that, Song, who's a parent, understands this probably better than me, but now parents in our Asian American community are also wondering if they should opt out from these tests. And I don't know enough to give you an answer because I'm not an educator, but I would love to have a conversation with you so that I can have a better understanding of it. Yeah.
Do you have more questions? Please come up to the microphone. So, Ruth, tell us more about the neighborhood profile, and with regards, do you know information about, just around specific schools? I know you picked the areas you did, you said from places you grew up, but I found that fascinating. I looked at my own neighborhood, the west side of St. Paul, this afternoon to look at the information, and it was just striking to me when you look at the schools in the area and how well they're doing and such. And do you see what are the correlations you draw from the data in that regard with regards to our neighborhoods in the Twin Cities?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm so glad that you looked up the profiles. I'll just let you know what they are and how to get to them, and then speak to some of those things that we see. So the neighborhood profiles are funded largely by the McKnight Foundation, so you can thank them if you find them useful. You go to our website, mencompass.org. In the upper right, you'll see a menu item called Profiles. Hover over that and then choose MSP Neighborhoods. And from there, you can see predefined neighborhoods with the boundaries set by the city, but you can also do a custom neighborhood, so you can choose your own, the area around your school or a transit way, or you can combine neighborhoods, you can draw. I did one of my route coming here, which is on Twitter, so you can see how many people lived along the route, because I'm a big nerd. So, yeah, so you can find that data, and you could pinpoint a school and look at the area around it. So some of the things that we notice looking kind of at there's a map on that page where you can create different themes by, as you saw, a number of households with kids, or poverty, or people of color, or population who are immigrants, and we see some interesting connections. For example, with race and poverty, there are some correlations. They're not completely, they're not everywhere. We noticed that there are some distinctions between even the two cities, as we saw that there's more households with youth in St. Paul. There tends to be just a difference in the communities that we see even within that. So when you click in the profiles, you can see like poverty rates for kids. You can see income levels for workers. So thinking of the parents of the kids. One thing that I find interesting in the employment data, we break it out by race, and you can look at the population in a neighborhood and see the share of people who are white, share of people who are Asian, that category, Black, and the share of adults who are working at a job it's different by race than the share of adults who live in the neighborhood, and often the white people have a higher rate of workforce participation. And that's something that we see kind of, whenever I've looked it up, that's something that I see. I can't say it's every neighborhood. And you also just see, talking about disaggregation, like differences within these neighborhoods. So I live in Hamlin Midway, and I drew a line along a street to the north of my house and a street to the south, which was University Avenue, and the demographic difference there was quite stark as well. So I think my case would be just go and look at the data, and make sure that what you're thinking is actually what's there in that community, and then take a step to talk to the people who are in that community and find out what they think about it as well.
Well, those of you who are educators here would love to hear even just comments, if you have them, on this, the question of demographics, and particularly like the poverty concentration. I feel like one of the things that happens, one of the distressing things that happens in debates about education is when it becomes polarized along the lines of union versus reform, whatever you want to call it, that often and I will say this as a union person, that I will often hear my union brethren say that that we focus too much on teachers and blaming teachers, and the real culprit is poverty. And the problem, and as I say to people when I hear this argument, is what we hear in communities of color and low-income communities when you say that is that until we solve poverty, we shouldn't expect our kids to learn. And that's not acceptable. And then that kind of stops the conversation. And I'd like us to think, sort of beyond that, right? Because in the end, that's why we want to disaggregate the data, is to figure out who are the people doing really, really well in those median, that brings the median income of Asian Americans high, but there are also people who are not doing very well, and how are these kids then doing in school? KaYing, thoughts on this at all?
Well, I mean, I think that when I showed you the graduation rates, that's very alarming, right? I mean, until we graduate students from high school, the cycle of poverty will continue to, will continue. And I think that Compass did say that if you have a high school degree, you have higher rates of being successful in the workforce, right? So it's the quality of education that also determines whether a person is going to be successful in the workforce. So if you have a bad quality of education and you graduate from college, you're going to continue to be impoverished. So for me, it's not really getting rid of poverty, it's really, and I think our community has shown that education is the key to success. And so for someone like me, I graduated from college, and because I have a college degree, my options for work is much better than what my dad or my mom would have. So I think that we're living proof, and that's why the qualitative data is so important, that if you have good quality education, then your chances of being successful is much greater.
Yeah, that's my personal experience as well. Is I come from a U.S. Public school system without an achievement gap. That's the Department of Defense schools. My dad was a career serviceman, and like many people who join the armed services, joined to escape poverty, and the Department of Defense school systems, educate extremely diverse populations, extremely economically diverse populations, but are able, for a variety of reasons that I think we don't, turn to them enough to look. It is to me the eternal frustration in these debates is that we can't seem to get past this, like poverty means we can't learn, which I think is absolutely absurd. Can you come up to the mic?
I just wanted to add that, this is not pitting communities against each other, but we have so many Fortune 500 companies here, and they're not hiring from within our community anymore. It's because we don't have qualified workforce here in Minnesota. So, I think that we should take a look at that and understand what is the root causes of all that stuff. It's not just bringing people from abroad, but it's because we don't have the workforce that's qualified to do those jobs. So how do we improve that? That's what they tell me. I don't know them. I don't have the data.
Please.
All right. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm nervous with the microphone. Thank you both so much for talking. I actually am coming out of higher education, just leaving a tenure-track job and coming back to Minnesota.
A little closer.
Okay, so I just moved back to Minnesota from rural Georgia, but my kids are back in the Minneapolis public schools. But one of the things, too, that you're talking about reminds me of people talk about, like, Title IX or Title I schools, right, and how bad they are, which essentially is just a measure of poverty, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the schools. It's just how many kids are in poverty with that,
Yes,
right?
yes.
But like my husband, I have a PhD and an MSW, and my husband has a master's, but we moved back with no jobs, right? So we're technically in poverty, right?
Yes.
And I think that's part of this conversation too, is that we put down title, you know, different schools have different things, so look at that too. And so, but the thing is, what I also want to say comparatively, like I think the problem with Minnesota is we have great rates for like white students, what you guys are talking about. But when we desegregate the data, which I'm so happy you talked about, because as a sociologist, that means a huge difference to that with policy. But how do we translate this to the people who it matters to, right? Because we're sitting here as an audience, as educators, right? Yes. People who care. Yes. But what does this matter to the guy across the street, right? How do we do this? That's kind of my question too. And also, how do we destigmatize what different like schools are when it's low income? It doesn't mean it's a bad school. It's a poverty rate, right? That doesn't mean kids are stupid. Like, I hate that. Sorry, that's like my big thing with it. So, thank you.
Do you want to answer that? I'll give you a chance.
Yeah, wow, you brought up so many good points. And welcome to Minnesota. Okay, welcome back. Yeah, I guess, I mean, one of the points that you brought up is something that we could kind of see in the data, the fact that it does matter to our future to address kind of the struggles that students might be having, because our future is increasingly made up of students of color and students from these groups who will be joining the workforce and who are our future. And if the graduation rates and the kind of testing levels are lower, that has an implication for our future. And absolutely, like, poverty doesn't mean people are bad at learning. But what does it, so how do we cope with that as educators and as an educational system? And considering what you heard, Javier, at your meeting, that people didn't think that that meant there was a different strategy needed. If we don't address things, we'll see exactly what the data are kind of almost showing right now as we go into the future. So it won't be a surprise, but it means that we have opportunities to keep Minnesota strong and make Minnesota stronger and work better for all of us.
One of the things that I would love to see Minnesota Compass help with. Have any of you ever used Zillow or a similar type of real estate app or anything like that? So I did that when my partner and I are thinking of moving to Minneapolis, and I was really shocked just at the kind of the use of data on their website. You know, you look at a house and then it tells you nearby schools. I don't have children, but I was just curious. I'm like, oh, and it gives you test scores and racial breakdown, and that's it. And it felt like a tool for like how to segregate yourself. It just felt like this is, oh no, you don't want to be in that neighborhood, or and I think it's really appalling, and it made me think that we need a community data set for like real estate. For people who are looking to see, like, schools with, different ways of assessing schools, number of, of programs or whatever it is, because it seemed to me that the values what they were transmitting is that these are the things that you should use to assess whether a neighborhood is good or not. And it seems like there's so much more information we could put into that that could hopefully lead to our cities being far less segregated, which is another huge problem when it comes to education. So that's my dream project that I'm going to give to you, Rachel, is an alternative to Zillow's community data. Any other questions? Do you have a question? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Yuma, and first of all, thank you, both of you, for such a great conversation. So I'm from Japan, so I moved here to go to college, so I don't identify myself as an Asian American. I'm Japanese, I'm Asian, and I have a little bit different experience than many of my peers who are Asian Americans. But being here for almost 5 years, I, experienced and internalized a lot of stereotypes. Like you talked about Asian Americans being a model minority. And I was never good at math back home, but everyone told me I'm good at math, and I was like, okay. But I was also told that, hey, you know, you're not like typical Japanese girl because you're outspoken, you know, you're not quiet. And then I'm like, what does this mean? And I was confused, but now I have better understanding. But I see myself now that I internalize a lot of stereotypes as well. So my question is, to me, to understand data, I strongly see the importance of incorporating intersectionality. So, for example, looking at education achievement gap, you have to, I think it's important to understand your race and your socioeconomic status and where you grew up, your family unit, I guess, style or whatever, to understand like the more complex issue. And then I also, many of my Asian American friends, they, what did I say? They express the struggles of embracing their sexual identity, because I have my friends who are Asian Americans and they're gay, they're lesbians, or they're transgenders. And they said that they had much more difficult times navigating themselves into education or into their family. And then my question is like, do you see in the future, you know, breaking down the data more and then incorporating like sexual identity so that you can understand, you know, complexity of youth of color go through, I guess, yeah.
I'll leave the data to Ruth, but I wanted to just quickly say something about that and also talk about curriculum, because the other woman who came back to Minnesota who's sitting at the bar, you said, how do we change the behavior in the mind of the person across the street, right? So I just want to say, and this is linked to what you're talking about. Ruth just told us how diverse our community is and the changing demographics. But our curriculum is not reflected in that, right? How often do we talk about the different genders in our classrooms, right? Without getting, you know, Board of Education all up in arms or other parents. How do we talk about me in the classroom instead of you coming to EdTalks, right? So that my child who's 8 years old already knows what her friend Mushtaq, her culture is about, why she wears her headdress and so forth from a very young age. Because if we don't do that, we're never gonna accept. And it's not overnight, right? It's really working together. And so I lived here 20 years ago, and when I walk around Minnesota, it does not look like the Minnesota that I remember. I used to go to the Mall of America, and I was the shortest and darkest person. When I go to the America, I'm not that anymore, right? So I see the changes socially and environmentally, but when you go to the classroom, our curriculum is still not reflective of that social change or the demographic change. So I think we need to do that, including the sexual orientation piece, right? And then for the data disaggregation, I want to say to the Board of Education, the pushback that we got, we had to change some. It was during the time when they were advocating for gender-neutral bathrooms, and we had a tiny word, you must collect data on gender. And the legislator who wanted to author that in the House made us change that word, right? So there's still a lot of issues in our community about sexual orientation that I'm also very new to. But we have to kind of, understand, and eventually, step by step, we'll make some changes, right? So,
Data. I think this is another case speaking to how people can identify in terms of gender and orientation. It's another case of the data sources reflecting our societal understanding, and perhaps the fact that wasn't something that people were able to be as open about or recognized about each other. Something has shifted, and we might see data sources catching up with that. If you look on the Compass website, you won't see any of our data broken out by orientation. and the genders that we show are male and female, and that's because that's what the data sources provide right now. So it would have to come from either from individual research projects opting to look into how you can ask that question in a respectful way to get accurate data. And that's something that we're working on at Wilder Research. Compass is based at Wilder Research in St. Paul. And so we've been working on how to do that with our own surveys. At the level of the census, it might take some, if that were a goal that a group wanted to achieve, it might take some organizing and some conversations at that level.
So I need to wrap up here. So two things. One, first, just want to make sure that you all fill out the survey. It's very important to EDTalks for our funding and just to know who was here and such. So if you could please fill that out. And I just wanted to close thinking about something, actually, how you opened KaYing. And for the educators in the room, when I was in kindergarten in Germany, my kindergarten teacher called in my mother for a parent-teacher conference to inform her that her son was willful, disobedient, and did not know how to pronounce his own name. And my mom was alarmed and said, what is he calling himself? And she said, he's saying Javier. And I call him, I say, Javier, listen to me, Javier, and he just ignores me. Now, my mother and I, we laughed all the way home, and that moment is very formative for me. I feel like I always say I learned a very important lesson that day. Adults are stupid. But I joke, but often I think for kids of color, we come at from a perspective of deficit when talking to kids of color or about them. And my mother, from that moment and forward, always taught us that, you know two languages. You know more than your teacher, which is always what when I got in trouble with that teacher later, I just look at her and I was thinking like, yeah, well, we already established that you are dumb. But to seek to think of these things as strengths, and these children that are the ever increasing populations in our schools as people who bring so much to the table, because in a situation, we hear a lot these days about microaggressions and things, and what in the conversations I have with younger people, what I encourage people to say is like, if we spend our day cataloging all the things that people have said about us or thought about us, you rerun the risk of becoming that, or becoming others' perceptions. And what we can instead do in that moment of pain, of whatever, is to realize that in that interaction that you're experiencing, you're seeing both that person's reality and yours. You know more in that instance. And that is something good for that child, and I think ultimately for this state, because the less children grow up thinking of themselves as coming from a perspective of deficit, and the larger society thinking that way, I think the better we all will be. So I thank you, Ruth, thank you, KaYing. Wonderful presentations. Stay tuned for more EdTalks, and please fill out those surveys before you take off. Thank you.